Good evening and welcome. I'm Pastor Tim Westermeyer, one of the pastors here at St. Philip the Deacon Lutheran Church, and on behalf of St. Philip the Deacon and Mount Olivet of Plymouth, which jointly present the Faith and Life Lecture Series, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We're thrilled you're here as we start the 9th season of the Faith and Life Lecture Series. A word about the flow here for this evening. You will hear from our speaker, obviously. Following that, there'll be a chance for some open mic Q&A, so be thinking about questions you may want to ask him. And then following that, there's actually going to be a reception, which is sponsored by our friends at Thrivent in the fellowship hall, and I think we've got apple crisp and decaf coffee. So stay for that and eat your hearts out. If you've followed the series over the last 9 years, you know that we have had a wide variety of speakers and topics. We've talked about everything from faith and humor and faith and theater and faith and lifelong learning and on and on and on. And we thought we would start this year's series with something that everyone in America can agree about: politics and the economy. And I do want to say just a word about this. When we invite people to come to these events, we have no expectation that everyone in the audience is going to agree with everything that is said. I have a feeling you will agree with many of the things that our speaker says. You may not agree with some. And I just want to say as we start, that's okay. All right? So is that a deal? You can read about the bio of our speaker. He is a consultant for many nonprofits and organizations on the economy, on finances. He has written a couple of books which are available tonight. He's been published in many, many major magazines. But I always ask our speakers if there's anything particularly unusual that is not in their standard bio. He shared with me a little of his theological background, which I think he's going to talk about a little tonight, so I won't get into that much now. But I will tell you that we're very fortunate he's here tonight, because in all seriousness, he was in a very bad car accident yesterday at 5 in the afternoon. Thank you. Down in Sarasota. So he's doing fine. I think the other person was fine as well, but we're grateful they weren't injured. Again, my welcome to you. Would you please help me welcome our speaker tonight, Gary Moore.
First thing I'd like to do is, I suppose you read the endorsement from my friend Dave Miller, who is an investment banker and is now the head of Princeton's, I call it God in Business Center. That's not the official name. One thing I want to tell you real quick, though, is that this is part of a day-long series, seminar that I do, and Dave endorsed it. This one has a little more politics in it to be timely for the season that we're entering, with next year being an election year. And I may say something politically incorrect tonight, and I don't want David to take the blame for it. So, as you can tell, Pastor Tim is very nervous about this. I sent him my outline, and he called me and he said, "Gary, are you sure you want to do this?" Well, I have a degree in political science. I've had 25 years on Wall Street, and I started to go to seminary. And the church said, help us with money, and politics became involved. And now what I do is where we usually separate those three areas of our lives, I try to show the connections between them. And so I talk about money, politics, and religion. Any one of the three will get me thrown out of this church. So what I ask is that we do it with a little humility, a lot of humility, and a little humor tonight. It's a very serious subject, of course. I was just downstairs. You know, the kids are downstairs having pizza and a movie. And the reason we're here tonight is not for us, folks. We're going to be okay. That's the first thing I want to tell you as senior citizens. We're doing this for the kids downstairs, and let's try to remember that and just be humble in our approach to this. There's actually a verse in the Bible that says Moses was the most humble man on earth. One of my favorite verses. But as far as the humor goes, I feel a little bit like Moses. We have a couple things in common. You may remember that Moses was not very eloquent. Okay? You can tell I have South in the mouth. I've been coming to teach and work at Luther Seminary for some time, and I still can't say Minnesota. Is that the way? I think you say it. The second thing we have in common is that I have some good material, but as this thing says, the hard part is in the marketing. I feel like the old guy in the Florida church who was sitting there, his wife passed him a note, And he opens it, and it reads, "Hon, I just let a silent one. What should I do?" And he takes out a pen, and he scribbles on it and passes it back, and she opens it and reads, "Change the battery in your hearing aid." Okay? I told that joke to 500 Lutheran stewardship leaders last year, and I think it's the reason Tim invited me. He said, anybody who can get by with telling that joke in church deserves to be at this speaker series. But sometimes I have to tell people hard things in connecting the three, hard truths. We are coming in, political season we often call silly season. In political science class I learned that in a democracy of a multicultural community nation like ours, politics is like sausage making. You don't really want to watch it done. You just kind of eat it when it's finished, okay? And you kind of wonder, this is the Houston Chronicle's depiction of what's going on in Washington, the deficit committee, and it says the room for negotiation is right here, and I've asked, where are those blessed peacemakers when you really need them? But the first thing I want to say tonight is we're not talking about gospel. We're going to talk about being wise as the serpents here tonight, and hopefully gentle as the doves, as Jesus asked. But it's not gospel. Gospel, Solzhenitsyn may have summed it up when he said, the line between good and evil does not run between nations or political parties. It runs through every human heart. And then he said again, and I mean every human heart. So what I want to say to you tonight is I believe our problems, if you want to look at it from a gospel perspective, is not structural. It's not as structural, the things that the guys are protesting on Wall Street, occupying Wall Street. It's not the protests of the Tea Party in Washington. It's sin, human sin. And if you can understand that as we begin, it will make this a whole lot easier. True religion, I believe, when I started to go to seminary and was actually reading the Bible, and I had grown up, as I'll tell you, in a Bible reading family, but I discovered that it spoke truths to both Wall Street and Washington. Remember now, I came of age studying political science during the years of Watergate, Vietnam and all of that, when government was the problem. It really was. But the truth of the scriptures sort of offends both sides. It's an equal opportunity offender, if you want. There are passages in the Bible that will absolutely drive progressives, I might use the term liberals, but I mean progressives here tonight. The Lord answered Samuel and said, do what they want and give them a king. If you go and read that passage, the interesting thing is Samuel is saying the people want a king. That's democracy, the people's will, okay? God wasn't real favorable about that. He said they'll be a whole lot better if they internalize my law as opposed to having it dictated by a king. And the people came back and said, no, we want a king because the other nations have them. So having a king really wasn't God's idea, wasn't his preferred idea, but he let it happen, okay? The interesting part about that passage, if you read it, God said, okay, give them a king, but let me warn you, here's what he's going to do. And if you read, it's all economics, Jerry. He said he's going to take the first of your fruits, and so on and so on. And what he was really saying, you can save yourself a lot of overhead. Government basically regulates behavior and transfers wealth. Well, if you behave yourself and live in charity with your neighbor, you can save a lot of overhead on government. Unfortunately, people aren't made that way, and they're not angels, as they say. There are other passages that will drive conservatives crazy, and let's get this card on the table. I know I'm near St. Paul, Minnesota, and you have a very prominent congresswoman, Michelle Bachmann, who's running for president. And I picked this one just because of that. It says, at the end of every 7th year, you're to cancel the debts of those who owe you money. Now, Mrs. Bachmann is a very sincere politician, I believe. I believe she means what she says and says what she means. And that's admirable in Washington today. However, not long ago on C-SPAN, they were deciding whether to let judges reduce the mortgage indebtedness of people who were underwater on their homes, the subprime mortgages and so on. And frankly, Mrs. Bachmann said on C-SPAN in front of the nation on the floor of the House that Judeo-Christianity would be opposed to the reduction of mortgage principal. Now, she's an attorney, and of course, contractually, by contract law in a capitalist society, a contract's a contract, a deal is a deal. However, theologically, okay, when the next few months you're going to hear both sides, the Democrats are now ramping it up, both sides are going to say, God's on my side, and they're going to find a verse in the Bible to prove it. Okay, you want to be very, very careful with that. Because what the Bible actually says is that the seventh year, not only was the Exodus about political freedom, it was about economic freedom. And they knew that debt could be bondage. Luther actually taught, and I understand Ms. Bachman is a Lutheran, if I understand, of the Wisconsin variety, I think, the very conservative Lutheran church. We're ELCA, of course. But long story short, I forgot my point. Maybe that's God's way of telling me don't go there. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Luther taught the principle of shared risk. What he in essence said is you can lend to somebody. You know, the church in essence forbade the earning of interest until the time of Martin Luther. The Protestant reformers changed that, made capitalism possible. But long story short, Luther said if you lend money to somebody and the venture fails, you can't demand repayment. You have to share the risk with that person. In a capitalist society, of course, if the house doesn't go up in value, then it's the borrower who has to take most of the penalty. But theologically, for 1,500 years, it wasn't determined that way. Shared risk. But the long story is, think about this. Would we have had the subprime crisis and the Great Recession and all the turmoil had the people making those loans knew that they were going to share in the risk? They would have been a lot more careful making those loans, right? The other question is since why capitalism says the greater the risk for a subprime loan, the more interest you charge. Well, where in theological history would you ever find that you charge higher rates of interest to the people least able to afford them? Pretty hard to justify, isn't it? What I'm telling you is there's actually a group of institutional investors, 300 of them, that manage over $100 billion called the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, religious investors, that actually submitted dozens and dozens and dozens of shareholder resolutions to the financial community during the 90s to have them clean up the subprime lending mess. And we probably, if anybody would have listened to them, what I'm telling you is there's a tension between morality and business. A healthy tension, but there is not a conflict, I don't believe, between sound morality and sound economics. The next thing I will tell you is that we're going to have religious leaders who are going to decide who they want, and then we're going to issue these voter guides or whatever that sort of have one-sided questions that encourage you to vote for the selected candidate. James Sanders wrote years ago in Torah in Canada, the true prophet does not engage in political diatribe to provide a rallying point for a particular course or action. He questions all the powers that be in the name of the one power beyond them. Often misunderstood, some people think prophets were fortune tellers. Not true. If you came here, by the way, to hear me predict the election or the stock market, you're going to be disappointed. All I can tell you is in 1999, Sir John Templeton and I wrote an article for Equities Magazine on why the last decade you would not make any money in stocks. That's the only semi-prophetic pronouncement I've ever made in my career probably, but it was a pretty good one. What the prophets were doing is having insights into the economy, into politics, into morality. And a lot of people think the prophets were always railing at the atheist. They weren't. They were always railing at God's people. You ever notice that? And what they were always railing about is not so much that they forgot God, but they were mixing God with a lot of other philosophies. It's called syncretism. And one of the things I'm going to talk to you tonight is how I believe both parties have more or less syncretized A lot of other philosophies with the Judeo-Christianity, particularly Calvinism, that built this country until about 1968. That's what we're going to talk about. I need to tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up Southern Baptist, probably what most people would call a fundamentalist today. I thought I knew the Bible. I won every Bible verse contest we ever had, I guess, Pastor Tim. And then I married an Episcopalian. And I went down to the Episcopal church, and you know what I discovered? There was about half the Bible I'd never heard of. And the reason why, you know how Baptists are always talking about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? Okay, our faith was pretty much vertical between God and ourselves. Okay, when I went to the Episcopal church, they operated largely on the horizontal platform, the section of the cross, between neighbors. In other words, a social gospel. You've heard people talk about the main line and the social gospel. Evangelicals and Baptists focus on the conservatives, in other words, focus on this dimension. The others focus on this. This is why Glenn Beck, not long ago, who's pretty far on the right, said if you ever go to a church that talks about social gospel, just leave. Okay, I don't know if you heard that, but that's actually what he told his listeners. Well, actually, neither one of them's right. This was in Christianity Today just this month, by the way. Baylor, which is a Baptist institution, just did a religion survey. Survey surprise, frequent Bible reading can turn you liberal in some ways. Now, when I'm with evangelicals, okay, my first book was published, I wrote it for the Episcopal Church, was published by an evangelical publisher. When I'm with evangelicals, they think I'm way over on the left. And when I go over and talk to my Episcopal friends, they think I'm way over on the right. Well, you know, that makes me very happy, because what it really tells me is, you remember St. Paul's moderation in all things? I don't think he exempted politics and economics, okay? Politics polarizes, as we are seeing. Economics polarizes. But true religion unifies, and you find moderation, and you learn how to get along in these secular affairs. The only thing we really should not moderate is our love for one another. You can be as excessive and radical about that as you want to be, but not about politics and economics. By the way, I worked with the Mennonites for a while, by the way, and they too, just like the Lutheran Church, you know, we have evangelical in our name. Did you know that? Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. But this is the part you may not know. If you combine all the state Lutheran social services agencies into one, you know it's twice as big as the next largest charity in America, which is Catholic Social Services. Jill Schulman does a great job. We don't get much credit because we're a little bit like the Baptists in that we're decentralized. But Lutheran Social Services is an enormous organization, and you should be very proud as Lutherans to be a part of that. I should tell you my political background is I was a Republican until about a year ago, and I became an independent. Okay, I'm still not a Democrat. I just decided being an independent was a good way for me to go. I want to tell you why. I grew up in the age of Richard Nixon. You know, even Billy Graham loved Richard Nixon, kind of got fooled by Richard Nixon. But Nixon once said, people react to fear, not love. They don't teach you that in Sunday school, but it's true. And I think ever since then, the Republican Party probably has a little edge on scaring people. You might remember the early 90s, Newt Gingrich was talking about, I had a quote that you'll get, by the way, when you leave here. Don't worry about writing this down, because you're going to get all these quotes. But there is one that'll be there. It's from an evangelical financial leader that said by 2012, America would look like Mexico. Well, to the best of my knowledge, that fence in Texas and Arizona is still there to keep the Mexicans out instead of keeping us in, okay? We just tend to exaggerate. They got caught up in Y2K. There's just an awful lot about conservatism that's fear-based today, which I don't particularly care for. Not that others don't do it. You may remember Bill Clinton, the economy stupid. The year he ran for office, my mentor, Sir John Templeton, who was a Rhodes Scholar in economics and the Dean of Global Investing, was calling for a soaring stock market in the most prosperous decade in history. And we all were convinced that the problems was the economy stupid. Henry Nouwen was a brilliant acquaintance of mine who taught at Harvard, Yale, Notre Dame, a very spiritual fellow, and he wrote one time, "The agenda of the world, the issues and items that fill our newspapers and newscasts is an agenda of fear and power. A huge network of anxious questions surrounds us and begins to guide many, if not most, of our daily decisions. Clearly, those who pose these questions which bind us have true power over us. Jesus seldom accepted the questions posed to him. He exposed them as coming from the house of fear. They did not belong in the house of God." Message to the church for both parties. If you start listening to fear-based things instead of love-based things, there is no fear in love. Anxiety is the end of faith. You can't have faith in God for the future and be anxious about the future at the same time. You are not listening to God if you're hearing the fear and anxiety that is surrounding you today. The Financial Times just a month ago, and you can't yet, here's the paradox, is you can't compartmentalize faith from any dimension of life. Jim Dobson says you can't compartmentalize it from raising children. Pat Robertson says you can't compartmentalize it from politics. I say you can't compartmentalize it from economics and financial planning. It can't be done. The Financial Times said the astonishing battle over fiscal policy that's raged in Washington these past months, bringing the U.S. to the brink of default, is a quarrel about the proper role of the state. But its intensity is impossible to understand unless you recognize that deeper values are also in contention. The fight has not been about politics alone. Listen to this carefully. It is also a clash of values, world views, whose adherents lately have no regard for each other. Religion is undoubtedly part of the mix. The Economist magazine understands that, and we should too. The Baylor study just came out. It was quoted by The Economist as well. By the way, I probably read as much about religion in the Wall Street Journal and The Economist as I did today's Lutheran as I was reading it on the plane coming up here. The Lutheran talks about politics and economics, and those guys talk about religion. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, Paul Frazee, who conducted the study, said this: "When Rick Perry or Michelle Bachmann say God blesses us, God watches us, God helps us, religious conservatives get the shorthand. They see government as a profane object, a word that is used to signal working against God's plan for the United States. To argue this is to argue with their religion. They say the invisible hand of the free markets," that's an old quote from Adam Smith, who was a professor of moral philosophy, by the way, is really God at work. They think the economy works because God wants it to work. It's a new religious idealism invoking God while chanting less government. It's the opinion of Baylor and The Economist magazine. Economist just published this. Red means recalcitrant. They asked voters, would you rather have a congressman who compromises to get things done, that's the black line, or sticks to his or her principles no matter what? Of the Democrats, 70% said they want people to compromise. Of the Republicans, 70% said they want them to stick to their principles regardless. One of the defining dimensions of evangelicalism that surprised me, you remember the passage in the Bible, we always quoted it as Baptists and so on, we never were real sure of our salvation. We had faith in it, that if we tried to live a good life and believed Jesus Christ was the Savior, that everything would turn out okay. But I wouldn't say we were real sure about it. A defining characteristic of evangelicalism is what we call certainty of faith. Now, it's one thing, I think, if you have a certainty of faith about your salvation, but what I've found is they have certainty of belief about the federal debt, about the role of the government, even about Y2K. I spoke for a radio station, Skylight Radio, it's over in St. Paul, I think, or is it Minneapolis? I'm not sure, at the college one time, and debated some people, and I was the only guy in the room who didn't think Y2K was going to end Western civilization. And they acted like I was nuts. And I told them all I'd done is really just laid in a little water like I would for a hurricane. and they just couldn't believe it. Certainty of belief. And that's why you have so many right now, Republicans in particular, who just don't want to compromise. There's a religious certainty about that. That's a problem, I think. Peggy Noonan, who's a spiritual lady herself, was Ronald Reagan's favorite speechwriter and now writes for the Wall Street Journal. She knows a thing or two about political economy and faith, and she wrote not long ago, "The biggest threat to America right now is not government spending, huge deficits, foreign ownership of our debt, world terrorism, 2 wars, potential epidemics, or nuts with nukes. The biggest long-term threat to our children downstairs is that people are becoming and have become disheartened, that this condition is reaching critical mass." And this was before the Occupy Wall Street movement began. As they say, I don't question the intentions of people, but as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I just think we need to understand that all this fighting is not doing our economy and the future of our children any good. John Bogle founded the Vanguard Mutual Funds. He's an acquaintance. He wrote a book called Enough. Began it this way. The people who created this country built a moral structure around money. The Puritan legacy inhibited luxury and self-indulgence. For centuries, it remained industrious, ambitious, and frugal. But over the past 30 years, much of that has been shredded. The country's moral guardians are forever looking out for decadence out of Hollywood and reality TV. But the most rampant decadence today is financial decadence, the trampling of decent norms about how to use and harness money. I don't think anyone would call John Bogle an anti-capitalist, if you will, but he has serious concerns. Frankly, the reason that I started to go to seminary during the Mike Milk and junk bond years. Remember when the S&Ls were crashing and so on? The church has to take some responsibility for this. You can't just blame it on Wall Street and Washington. Remember the thing in the verse in the Bible that says, judgment begins in the house of the Lord, as goes our moral institutions, so go our culture. Doug Meeks wrote God the Economist. He was a professor at Wesley Seminary in Washington. I don't think he's there now, but he was when he wrote this. I knew him. He says, the way stewardship's practiced in North America often has little to do with the Bible. It stems primarily from the most influential American theologian, Andrew Carnegie. The Christian religion, Carnegie maintained, becomes pertinent only after production has run its course, money has been made, and money has been reinvested. In other words, Carnegie said the Christian faith has to do with charity, and charity does not extend to the question of economics. What Carnegie, in essence, said is you can make your money as a robber baron if you want, as long as you give it away before you die. Okay? Now, I happen to serve on the board of a well-known Christian ministry, worldwide well-known, with Ken Lay of Enron. And as we know, Ken gave a lot of money to churches and charities. But I don't think Ken's going to be remembered as one of the great Christian stewards of our time. Okay? Charity is not stewardship. Giving is not stewardship. I should tell you, by the way, one of the things that I've found in business, do you ever have a little check in your spirit about the guys who have fishes on their on their business cards and so on and so on? One of the things I've noticed is more people talk about the Bible, the less they know is in it, particularly about political economy. Do you remember Jim Baker of PTL? Jim wrote a fascinating book when he got out, and he said, when I went to jail, I actually had 5 years to read the Bible. And he said, you know something funny? I was teaching everything upside down. He said he had been, during the whole time he was on PTL, he'd been quoting what other writers had been saying in their books instead of actually reading the Bible and seeing what's in there. Now I'm going to step on some toes. I happen to like the guy, but you ever watch Joel Osteen? Most prominent minister today. How does he start every service? Holds up a Bible. What's he say? Something like, this is the Bible, I believe what's in it, I am what it says I am, or whatever. Yet when 60 Minutes and others have asked Joel, why don't you ever talk about money? You know what he says? It's not my gift. It's not my gift. And frankly, most pastors are that way. Do you know Thrivent did a survey among us Lutherans, of all people? Do you know about half of Luther's 95 Theses were about the church's abuse of money? The Roman Church, of course. And yet the Thrivent survey showed most of you don't believe we should talk about money in churches. Are you aware of that? Thrivent did that survey quite a time ago. Well, if you don't have a gift for talking about money, I would suggest you start a self-help society, because you are not preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. 22 of his parables were about money. Not all of them were about money, but he used money to make points because people are interested in money. And you have to talk about what people are interested in and affects them. The church is pretty much irrelevant to my life from Monday to Saturday. Church never says anything that's of much help to me on Wall Street. That's why I started to go to seminary. I literally, at the end of a year, looked at the board. They said, what do you want to study? And I said, the moral foundations of political economy and personal finance, and their eyes glazed over. They said, Gary, we don't teach anything like that. I said, well, I don't need a major in it. I just want to take a course. They said, Gary, we don't teach a sub-course within a course on that. I said, do you know this was a favorite topic of Moses and Jesus? And they said, literally, yes, but we don't teach it. Fairly common today. Okay? Laura Nash of Harvard actually studies this stuff, writes quite a few books on religious business life. She says the church's often dismissive response to the layperson's optimistic desire to integrate faith and career cannot be justified. In fact, this attitude may be the largest act of self-marginalization mainstream churches have ever engaged in. I will tell you, the evangelicals are growing. They think it's because of their biblical adherence to social values, homosexuality, and so on. I'm telling you, it's because they're the most liberal, money people, Christians in the history of the world. Okay, they talk about money all the time, but it's always about how do you get more? God wants you to be rich and so on. It's called the prosperity gospel. We've stopped talking about it, and it's a very bad mistake. By the way, I tell people I spend about half my time wishing the main line would talk about money, and the other half wishing the evangelicals didn't talk about money. Okay, that's kind of the way the church is today. My mentor, John Templeton, said, it's very interesting to me that the spread of communications has increased the misery of people. We're flooded with bad news. And this bad news is making people depressed at a time when prosperity is its greatest ever. I'll tell you why he says that. John was a brilliant guy, Rhodes Scholar in economics, dean of global investing, established the Templeton Prize, which is the Nobel of religion, if you will. You know there's no Nobel Prize for religion, so John thought it was important, and he endowed it for a larger amount than the Nobel Prizes to say it's the most important subject in the world. We had our theological differences, but the man was prophetic about the political economy. He knew what he was talking about. And he always told us, don't read the mainstream press. Anybody here ever read a paper headline or hear a headline in the news that says 30,000 planes arrived safely yesterday? That's reality. Now, let me put this in economic terms. I have friends who will not fly because the only thing they hear about airplanes is that they crash. And so they drive. Do you know that flying is about twice as safe as driving per mile traveled? So they subject themselves to greater risk because of their perceptions that come from the media. And Sir John always said, you don't want to do that. I used to hold up a piece of paper and say, what do you see? And people would say, a piece of paper. And I'd take out a pen and I'd put a dot on it and I'd say, what do you see? And everybody'd say, what? A dot. That's not what you see. That's your problem. What you really see is a very large piece of paper with a very small dot on it. Okay, now let me put that into economic terms. How many here, I've done this to tens of thousands from Robert Schuler's show to across America to college professors, Christian economics. How many of you have heard we have almost a $15 trillion federal debt? Okay, everybody. That's the dot. How many have ever heard the size of America's assets if you haven't heard me speak? Anybody? I've never found one American, including economists at Christian colleges. And yet the same people who estimate the debt estimate our assets, as I'm going to show you. But what happens if you stare at this long enough and you can't see this? What's that called? Paranoia. The number one Jim Dobson Focus on the Family promoted book about Y2K by Shanti Feldhahn began by saying, I didn't think Y2K would be a big problem, but the more I looked at the problem, the bigger I realized it was. It's exactly what it said. That's how the book began. And that's who I debated over in St. Paul in 1999, and they thought I was nuts. Japan has a pretty technological society, wouldn't you agree? You know how much they spent on Y2K? 0. That was purely a media event in the United States. Here's the negative dots they ask you to focus on. Federal debt, Times Square, the national debt clock, right? Everybody sees this over and over again. You ever heard that the deficit today, this is taxes, federal taxes, this is spending, so the deficit's 9% of our national income? You've heard those things, right? Now here's the paper most Americans never see. You know that Tea Party stands for taxed enough already. If you're not aware of that, it's a tax movement, okay? On gross income of $100,000, May 2011, this just came out 2 weeks ago. This is the United States. This is federal taxes, including Social Security. If you make $100,000, Belgium takes almost 50%, Greece, Germany, France, Denmark, and so on. Here's the United States down here. That's Russia and United Arab Emirates. Not exactly major economies today. This is total taxes. Every tax you can think of, according to The Economist magazine. Okay? Total tax revenue, this 2007, this lags quite a bit. Denmark, you can see what we call socialist countries take roughly half your income in taxation. Denmark, Sweden, France, Norway, Italy, Spain, Britain, and so on. Here's the United States down here, roughly 28%. In other words, the only country, Japan's the same as we are, and then there's Mexico. And you're still free to go to Mexico if you want to save some taxes. Okay? I don't know too many people doing it. But I do want you to focus on Denmark. Not only is it a good Lutheran country, okay, I want to talk to you a little bit about that. It's one of the highest taxed nations on earth. You know what it's also famous for? It has the happiest people on earth. That's what the surveys say. The other interesting thing is our Small Business Administration says it's easier to start a small business in Denmark than any place on earth. That doesn't sound like anything you've ever heard, does it? I mean, isn't that socialism run amok or whatever everybody says? I don't know. Denmark pretty much refutes everything that you've heard about economics, most likely. Forbes magazine, which is not exactly a liberal publication, okay, went down to the mall when the big Tea Party movement was there and did something that I've done with my clients for some time. I asked them, what percentage of the national income do you think taxes take? Okay? And here's what they found. Tuesday's Tea Party crowd thought federal taxes were almost 3 times as high as they actually are. Tea Partiers also seem to have a very distorted view of the direction of federal taxes. More than 2/3 thought the taxes are higher today, yet federal taxes are very considerably lower since Obama became president. Forbes magazine, the capitalist tool. Here's something else Forbes said. You know, Obama's talking about the millionaire's tax. You know, that's not a tax on millionaires. What that is a tax on people making $1 million or more a year. He wants to raise the taxes. This is why out of Forbes magazine, if you make between $1,000 and $25,000, you pay roughly 2.5%, 2% or so of your income in taxes, federal income taxes. It goes up until you reach $500,000 in income. Then it goes sideways until you reach $1 million. Then a strange thing happens. It starts falling until you get to the 400 richest people on earth. And where the guys making $500,000 to $1 million are paying 24%, they're down to about 18%. Okay, I was fortunate when I was on Wall Street that I had a few years in this category, and it kind of irritated me. I knew a couple of guys on the Forbes 400 list to find out that they were paying a lot lower taxes than what I was. That's what Warren Buffett is all about today. I actually visited with a Christian leader last week. He had a friend who made $30 million last year. He paid $300,000 in federal income tax. Sounds like a lot. That's 1%. $30 million, and he paid 1%. Okay? By the way, it's kind of interesting that these are the guys who always want a flat tax. Well, what they want is flat down here. Okay? They don't really want to flatten that one out if it goes up. I'm one of those guys. Here's what the Journal actually said in 2008. In a sign of increasing inequality in the U.S., the richest 1% of Americans in 2006 garnered the highest share of the nation's adjusted gross income for 2 decades and possibly the highest since 1929, according to the IRS. Meanwhile, the average tax rate of the wealthiest 1% fell to its lowest level in at least 18 years. The group's share of the tax burden has risen, but not as quickly as its share of income. Wall Street Journal. It also said the U.S. is becoming a plutonomy, an economy dependent on the spending and investing of the wealthy. On Wall Street, we call it the barbell economy. You should either invest in Tiffany's, Gucci, all of the high-end shops, or you should invest in Dollar General. The people who are suffering is the middle class. Okay, the Targets, Target, as my wife calls it, or whatever. Okay, that's what's happening in the United States. That's why you've got the Tea Party on one side and the Occupy Wall Streeters on the other. Here's the problem with that. We do know that inequality produces economic growth to a certain point. It's like you're on a treadmill and you got a piece of cheese. Anybody read the book, Who Moved My Cheese? Okay, if they move it just a little, what do? You run a little bit faster, don't you? What happens, however, when that cheese gets so far out that you know you're never going to get it? You stop. That's called social mobility. We've all put up with this disparity in income because we all think we're going to be in that 1% one of these days. You know what the Occupy Wall Street's about? Is the kids are saying, I'm never going to be there. The cheese has moved too far. I'm giving up. And that's the hope and despair that we're facing today. The other problem is that it may produce more economic benefits, but it has some very unpleasant social benefits. And this is the irony. Listen to this, The Economist magazine. Within the rich world where destitution's rare, countries where incomes are more evenly divided have longer-lived citizens and lower rates of obesity, delinquency, depression, and teenage pregnancy than richer countries where wealth is more concentrated. Teenage pregnancy, what does that mean? Abortions. Okay? By supporting, if you're voting your wallet, you may well be supporting a lot of causes that we in our churches, and particularly our conservative churches, are opposed to and fighting every day. This is caution, nothing new under the sun. Andrew Mellon in the 1920s had the same idea my friend Jack Kemp did. I was an advisor to Jack, and Jack thought tax cuts could cure cancer. Andrew Mellon thought the same thing and reduced the tax rate, and the share of the top 1% went from 15% almost to 25%. Jack, in essence, with Art Laffer, formulated Reaganomics, cut taxes on the wealthy. This is a share of the 1%'s income. It's almost back up to 1929 levels. Does the year 1929 bother anybody? It scares daylights out of me. Here's the other thing. Go back to that chart. Federal revenue, if you look, this is 1950, the year I was born. You have to go back till the year that this white bearded guy was born to have federal taxes as low as they are today, roughly 14%. And we all think they're roughly, by the way, I asked my mother last week, and she thought they were about twice as high. But I usually get somewhere between 2 and 3 times as high because of the political perceptions people have. Wall Street Journal, the average American household receives 9.4% of his or her income from the government, Social Security and so on. This is us down here. This is Canada. We think it's socialistic. Here's France up here at about 33%. 3 times as high as we are. We are hardly socialistic, folks. We've had much higher deficits in the past. You should know that today we're at 9% deficit of the federal, of our gross national product, national income. In 1940, during the wars, guys, you had 28% deficits in the United States. In World War I, you had 22%. Today, we've got 2 wars going in Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, and yet it's the first time in the history of the United States, you might remember W lowered taxes while those 2 wars were going on. We have never cut taxes during a war before. That's something of an experiment that's been happening. But basically, until the war's gone, I don't think it's going to happen. The other thing people won't tell you, people ask me all the time, what's the stock market going to do? I say, if I knew that, I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be out on my yacht somewhere, okay? But do you know in 2001, The Economist magazine and the Office of Management and Budget in the White House was actually predicting when W was elected that the federal debt would be down to $1 trillion today instead of $15 trillion. But we had tax cuts and we had wars and expenditures and bailing out Wall Street and so on. So if we can't really predict that, you know, there's a verse in the Bible that says no man can predict the future. Jesus said that's one of the reasons you shouldn't worry so much about tomorrow, because you really don't know what it's going to bring, if you can put it in spiritual terms. This is the other thing. The most noted thing about the federal debt is you compare it to your national income. Today it's at 60%. That's what this line is. This is projected, okay? This is if you continue current policies, this if you make some changes. Obama's plan is sort of in the middle. We're at 60%. At the end of World War II, when my dad came home with a lot of you guys, it was twice as high. He didn't know it. He didn't have anybody telling him. He just went to work and paid it off. But it was twice as high as it is today. We talk about unemployment a lot. How many of you remember that in the second year of the Reagan administration, we had higher unemployment than we do today? Anybody remember that? Yeah, memory loss. This is non-farm jobs, how they've grown. This is Reagan. He had 10% unemployment. This is the unemployment rate up here. And this is Obama right here at 9%. People don't remember that. We think this is something unprecedented in human history. You've heard that manufacturing's gone kaput in the United States and we're a nation of hamburger flippers. That's not actually true. This is manufacturing output in the United States since 1972. It's just gone up and up and up. What is true, however, is we are doing it with fewer and fewer manufacturing employees because of technology, efficiency, and so on. In essence, what we're doing in the country today, CNBC did a special on this not long ago. The Fortune 500 biggest companies in America, used to employ 16% of American workers just a few years ago. Now it's 11%. We are paying CEOs, in essence, to be more productive, which means get more work out of fewer people. At the same time, we're paying the guys in Washington to create jobs. Marx called that a contradiction of capitalism. Marx actually predicted that would happen. Marx is a hot topic in economics right now. I know I sound like a communist. Been a Republican all my life and advisor to Jack Kemp, but Marx predicted that. You've heard this stuff about China owns America. Do you remember when Japan was going to buy America? They bought the Rockefeller building and everybody went nuts. What happened to Japan? No man can predict the future. Today, China, we import 5% of our spending from China. Most people I ask say 25 to 30%. It's actually 5%. That, by the way, is exactly what we've been importing from Canada for many years. Until just this summer, I think, Canada was actually our leading trading partner as opposed to China. The reason China is so politicized, of course, well, first I've got to say this. The average Chinaman still makes $4,000 a year. We make over 50. Okay, so their income is 1/10 of ours. Of course, they have 5 times as many people. So their economy will overtake us in the next decade or so, but it's because they have so many people, but they'll still be living on less than half of what we are. But they hold $1 trillion of our treasury securities. In essence, Chinese save 50% of their income. You know, we're back up to saving 6% again. We used to save 10, it went down to nothing, now it's back to 6. They save 50%. What do they do with it? They buy a lot of treasury bonds from the United States. Okay? That is 1%, according to the White House, 1% of America's assets. 1%. China owns. The other thing they don't say is that, in essence, if you say America owes, or Chinese own $1 trillion worth of our treasury bonds, what they don't tell you is how many Chinese stocks does Gary Moore own. Jeremy Siegel at Wharton has calculated that every dollar of international indebtedness is matched by a dollar of assets abroad. In other words, if the Chinese ever decide to sell their treasury bonds, what's Gary Moore going to do? He's going to sell his Chinese stocks because the world's about to implode anyway, and then I'm going to buy our treasury bonds. Okay? They're not going to do that, guys. It'd be foolish. Interest expense, you've been hearing the debt's going up and up and up. What were interest rates under Ronald Reagan? Anybody remember? 16, 17% on treasury securities. You investors remember the good old days of 16% 6-month CDs. Interest expense under Reagan was 4.2% of our national income. Today it's 2.8%. The other thing is Americans own 1/2 of America's treasury bonds. Of the $15 trillion in debt, we own $7 trillion. Anybody own an E-bond or a treasury bill or a money market fund with treasury securities in it? You own the federal debt. What do you call that? An asset. Okay? You think it's part of your future security. At the same time, you think it's going to ruin the future of your children. Do you understand that? It doesn't make much sense, does it? Okay. There is a socialist senator, an actual socialist senator named Bernie Sanders. I think he's from Vermont. The other day, and I confirmed this in the Washington Post, the top 6 financial institutions in this country own assets equal to more than 60% of our gross domestic product. In other words, you could take Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and so on, sell them to the international funds or whatever, and retire the federal debt. Frankly, some of those guys I wouldn't miss a whole lot, okay? Kind of make my life difficult. Now, here's something that you have the handout for when you came in. Open it up. I want you to see it. I have business people. By the way, don't feel bad you've never seen this. I have 2 friends who are congressmen who serve on major financial committees in the House of Representatives, and they've never heard these numbers. And there's one serving today anyway. This comes out of the budget. It was W's last budget. I speak to a lot of conservatives, and you don't tell them Obama says anything. They won't believe it. So I go back to Bush's last budget, okay? By the way, Obama has omitted this from his budget, so don't go looking at it for it currently. But this is what it said in the end. This was in 2009, I guess, $08. Adds up all the assets of America, and if you go down here to where I put an A, $125 trillion worth of assets in America. $125 trillion. B is total net indebtedness overseas is $7.2 trillion. Subtract that from the 125 and you get C, which is $118 trillion is the net worth of America after all debts are paid off. Anybody think America's going bankrupt? D, by the way, calculates, this is what the president and the guys look at, the percent of national wealth that our federal debt is. In other words, if you had a $100,000 mortgage on your or a $100,000 house and you owed $7,000, that's what it relates to. It's roughly, on this one it was 6.5. Today it's 7.2%. That's the federal debt in relation to our assets. Okay, do you see how putting things in context, do you understand why the prophets went to the mountains? To see things in context more like God did? Unbelievable difference. And when John Kennedy took office, every American was worth $115,000 in today's dollars. These are inflation adjusted. At the end of 2008, they were $388,000. Average net worth went up threefold, and everybody thinks America's going bankrupt. The World Bank calculates wealth a little differently. What it says is the United States has 512,000 wealth per capita. Now you may say, no, Gary, I don't have that much. Did you include your part of this church? What about part of the roads that you drove here on? This is part of what's called the independent sector. The roads are what's called the public sector. Nobody ever includes those in their net worth. Have you invested anything in this church? Of course you have. Okay, is it enrich your life every week? The kids watching movies downstairs and so on? Of course, nobody ever includes. I can't even get people to include the value of their life insurance. They've been investing in it their whole life and they forget that it's out there. Okay? That's what we're doing. We're thinking poor. This is when Ronald Reagan took office, average net worth, per capita net worth in 2010 dollars, inflation adjusted, was about $55,000. Today, it's roughly $170,000 per person in America. This is the way the Bush White House. Conclusion, the Bush White House said the size of the net foreign debt is relatively small compared with the total stock of U.S. assets, what I call D. In 2007, it amounted to 7% of total assets, including education and R&D capital. It does include the value of education. I'm an old farm boy from Kentucky. All that farmland in the world wouldn't help me get a good paying job at Google or Microsoft. It's all up here in what you know. We're in the information age. I think it's very valid to include education in that wealth. This is a chart of that, Kennedy down to Obama today, 7.2%. America's federal debt in relation to our assets has been in decline in this country for 50 years. 50 years. Never found one American who knows that. The Economist magazine recently reported on a study by the International Monetary Fund, how much debt can we handle? Instead of just relating it to income, they related it to assets. My son, let's say that he makes $50,000 a year and he has no income. He goes to a bank, he says, I want to borrow $500,000. What's the odds he'll get it? Not in today's world, huh? Now, let's say I'm worth $1 million and I retire and my income's $50,000. Can I get a $500,000 loan? You bet I can. Okay, you've got to consider assets. And when the World Bank did this, the International Monetary Fund, they said that we can handle, the 2015 forecast is that we will have over 100% of our national income in federal debt. They said we can handle 73.6% more, which is roughly another $10 trillion. I'm not a prophet, but I'll make this projection. If we elect a Republican next year, they will remember the virtues of deficit spending. Okay, Reagan did it, W did it, and we'll do it again. That's just a prediction on my part. Economists do know how much debt helps an economy. Think of it this way. We have an apple tree, Jerry. You're picking the lower fruit, right? I live next door to you. You can't reach the top. You say, Gary has a ladder. I'm going to go borrow the ladder. So I come over, we put the ladder down, you pick apples at the top. You give me a few apples to thank me. That's called interest, okay? Is that a moral problem? That was the insight Luther had, okay? Here's the problem, though. What if we go around and borrow 12 ladders and pile them on a tree? You're going to break the tree. Okay, economists can calculate that, folks. And here's what it's saying. U.S. growth per additional dollar of debt is down to almost zero. Now, there's other reasons to borrow other than growth. You might borrow to send a kid to college, for example. Okay, but we know that. There's no reason for cynicism. The guys weren't idiots back here because they borrowed some ladders from China. But we are reaching the point where we've got to come up with different growth strategies. Here's the other thing I want to tell you about churches. You hear all this stuff about credit card debt, credit card debt, credit card debt, especially in the churches. We have a lot of ministries, okay? I've been running around for 20 years telling people credit card debt is not a major problem. It is for some people, young people getting out of Luther Seminary and so on. By the way, that's one reason pastors believe this, Tim. Can you think of anybody that has more debt with the prospects of earning less over their career than pastors? They always believe debt is a huge issue. So these guys come around and say, if you'll let us pay off everybody's credit card debt, giving is going to explode. Well, here's the reality, and was finally put in a religious book, a scholarly one, is that one commonly cited statistic in the media is the average American owes more than $8,000 in credit card debt. Numbers like that are hugely inflated by a relatively small number of people in huge debt. The median average was $2,200. The median balance represents 3% of all debts held by Americans. Now, if I go into America's churches, particularly the evangelical churches, and even ours, even mine, we had one of those debt ministries come in, and they say, here's your problem with credit card debt. Now, I happen to live in a community of retirees, Jerry, as you know, and they're pretty affluent. You know, the reason they use credit cards? To buy BMWs to take trips around the world on the frequent flyer miles. Okay, that's what it's talking about. Okay, but our stewardship department got this mailing, and so they had a credit card ministry. Now, meanwhile, they've got all these trust funds and stuff that haven't considered ethics since they've been around. Okay, and John Bogle is saying it's the largest problem that we have of immorality in the country. Shouldn't we focus on that instead of 3% of America's debt? I would like to think so. Did Osama use a page from Reagan's playbook? A lot of people think Reagan and Margaret Thatcher pointedly bankrupted the Soviet Union with, remember Star Wars, defense spending? When Russia tried to keep up, it imploded internally. Osama bin Laden once said, I will bankrupt the United States. To date, we have spent $3.2 trillion on these wars. And we haven't raised taxes for them, so, you know, we have to borrow the money, basically. This is a chart of the federal debt since the founding of the country. We started here in Revolutionary War. It was high. It came down until 1860. The Civil War went up. World War I went up. World War II went out of sight. We had the Cold War, came down again under Clinton, and then went up with the current wars. Roughly 50% of the accumulated federal debt is because of wars. Congressmen do not like to call up and say, I'm raising your taxes, and by the way, I want your son or daughter to go off to fight a war. That's a short career, so they tend to borrow the money instead of raise taxes. So what do we have? Everybody's unhappy. We have the eye of the needle. The Economist magazine recently, the people most satisfied with their national conditions. You know, 70% of Americans say we're on the wrong track. Here's the United States. Only 30%. These are the rich countries. Germany, United States, France, Japan, and Britain all are miserable. It's miserable rich. The happiest nation on earth, China. 87% of Chinese are happy even though they live on 1/10 of our income. The next is India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Russia. You know how much money you need to be happy? Just a little bit more than your neighbor. Okay? And we live in a pretty rich culture, the Forbes 400, basically. What's the root of our problems? It all happened when I was in college. UCLA does a study of why incoming freshmen are in college. When I went to college in 1968, roughly 70% of us said we were there to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. You remember the hippie years? Peace and all that stuff, okay? That crossed In 1974, by the way, 30% said they were there to be very well off financially. Crossed in 74, the people who are now leading your country, 70% of them went to college to make money, 30% to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Okay, it's what happened to America. We're going to seek first all of this, and the spiritual kingdom will result, right? That's materialism. If you believe you'll be happy because you get more, that's materialism. If you say, or like Jesus, and say, seek first the spiritual kingdom, and then the other stuff will result, then you're a spiritual person. That's the difference in the two philosophies. This is the leading materialist of our time. You have an article about her. I wrote a feature article in Christianity Today, September of last year, about how many evangelicals have integrated, syncretized is a better word, this lady into their Christianity. Her name was Anne Rand. I had a brother-in-law who used to teach her in a Baptist church. Did not know that she wanted to be remembered as the greatest enemy of religion in history. She wanted to be Nietzsche's Antichrist. Nietzsche predicted there would be an Antichrist. She wanted to fill the role. She was a student of Nietzsche. This, by the way, is a stamp. Can you imagine a stamp of Jesus Christ today? But our government, in essence, immortalizes the Antichrist. She wrote, we will give people a faith, a positive, clear, and consistent system of belief. This is a metaphor for America. Library of Congress survey, most influential books. This is from Amazon, add to cart, the Holy Bible. Christianity Today's done an article called The Least Read Book in America or something like that, talking about everybody owns 4 or 5, nobody reads it, okay? One book they do read is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, number 2 book in influence in the country. In essence, says the exact opposite of what the Bible says. That's what your leaders are reading. Main Street today is somewhat focused on the Bible, metaphor for America. Your leadership is focused on Ayn Rand, power. Nietzsche was all about will and power and making money. Economist Magazine 94 named her the most influential woman in the world. Ayn Rand, the heroine of America's libertarian right, described her philosophy as the concept of man as a noble being, not a fallen being, but a noble being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life. Love yourself, let your neighbor love his or herself. With productive achievement as his noblest activity, the making of money, she substituted the dollar in the last line of Atlas Shrugged to replace the cross as a symbol of what we strive for. There was a symbol of the dollar at the head of her casket when she died. And reason as his only absolute. No revelation, no church tradition, none of that, just what you think is reality. The irony of that is if anybody thought differently than she did in her little cult or group, she excommunicated them immediately. You could reason as long as you reasoned like she did. In other words, she wanted to be God. The Reagan presidency provided opportunities for a few objectivists, is what they call themselves, to try their hand at their most hated institution, government. Not really. Christianity was her most hated institution because St. Paul says to honor and obey government. Jesus said to render unto Caesar, so she hated Christianity worse. The most celebrated Randist to even survive the passing of the Reagan years, Alan Greenspan, was an acolyte of Rand's in the 1960s. Moral purpose of your life is to make money. I used to have people tell me that Alan Greenspan was going to tighten credit. I'd tell them that's about as likely as Billy Graham's going to stop handing out Bibles. If the moral purpose of your life is to make money, you're going to put a lot of them out there. By the way, Ben Bernanke is called Helicopter Ben. He was once asked what happens if the Fed creates money, puts it in the bank, nobody will borrow it. He says, if I have to, I'll print $100 bills, fly across America, and throw them out of a helicopter. He's been known as Helicopter Ben ever since. Her number 1 thesis is selfishness is a virtue. That was actually the title of one of her small books. This is the Wall Street Journal, Greed is Good, about Wall Street bonuses. Jennifer Burns wrote the most scholarly book about her. One thing I will tell you, if you read her books, remember she wrote romanticized fiction. It sounds wonderful. Every business person in those books is a hero. There are no bad guys, no subprime mortgage originators, and so on and so on. But Jennifer Burns is a professor who wrote Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right. She wrote, Rand was blazing a trail distinct from the broader conservative movement, as indicated by the title of her second nonfiction book, The Virtuous Selfishness. Whereas traditional conservatism, I'm a conservative, right of center, emphasized duties, responsibilities, get that word, responsibilities, social interconnectedness. At the core of the right-wing ideology that Rand spearheaded was a rejection of moral obligations to others. That's the key. There's a difference in libertarians and conservatives. Bill Buckley and the conservatives couldn't stand Rand. She couldn't stand them because we were always loving our neighbors. She said to Playboy, my views on charity are very simple. I do not consider it a major virtue, and above all, I do not consider it a moral duty. What I am fighting is the idea that charity is a moral duty and a primary virtue. No one's aware of her ever doing anything charitable for anybody. Well, I take it back. She wrote a check to the state of Israel one time. Economist magazine said for her, government was nothing more than licensed robbery, and altruism was an excuse for power grabbing. Okay? You ever hear a conservative say the government's, it's my property, so if government takes it, they're stealing from me? What's that begin with? I own it. Okay? Lenin said the government owns it. What did the Bible say? Who owns wealth? God. You start with an unbiblical principle, you'll end up with an unbiblical economy. Gary Hall, my local paper, did an article on my financial seminary, and I was criticizing Rand and another fellow I'll talk about in a minute. The director of the values and ethics in the marketplace at Duke University said religion is incompatible with the profit motive. The irony is, as I served on the board at Robert Schuler's with a guy named J.B. Fuqua, who gave $30 million to fund the Duke Business School. And this young guy is telling them J.B. couldn't do what J.B. did. John Allison, retired chairman of BB&T Bank, told the New York Times Ayn Rand filled in the ideas of Aristotle. It's a whopping competitive advantage. Aristotle was elitist, by the way, all Nietzschean philosophies. I hear you have Eric Metaxas coming, who wrote Bonhoeffer. Hitler was a disciple of Nietzsche, the will, the elitist, the Aryan elitism. For Rand, it was the American CEO, was her, she called him John Galt, the human savior. It's a whopping competitive advantage. I personally believe objectivism will be the dominant philosophy in this country in 25 years. Advantage for who? My local paper, I was going to ignore this, did an article about, in Florida at least, when banks repossess a house, they got to keep the lawn up. One of the wealthier neighborhoods, BB&T repossessed a house. The pool is all green, the lawn's grown up. The homeowners association spent $3,000. They do not understand why BB&T has not assumed its responsibility. The lack of response has been astounding. Well, if you don't have any social responsibilities and your only purpose is to make money for your shareholders, why would you fool with somebody's bank? I mean, isn't that a whopping competitive advantage? Now, that's a small thing. The Financial Times just recently did a full page on tax wars, a fight worth billions, and they focused on BB&T Bank because what they were doing, this is a symbol for Barclays Bank in England, through financial engineering, we call it, they generated tax deductions that kept BB&T from paying a whole lot of income taxes. But if your only purpose is to make money and you don't have any social responsibilities for a country that's having huge deficits, why wouldn't you? Is that a whopping competitive advantage? Well, it is for some. It's not for others, not for the rest of us. The person who spread this philosophy in business boardrooms was Milton Friedman. He famously said there's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities to design to increase its profits. That's your only social responsibility, is to make money. He also said the church tends to believe that it should exercise control not only over the spiritual realm, but also over the material realm, and that's where all the difficulties arise. In other words, you guys, moral philosophers, just get out of the way and let us economists handle things. Guys, the economy is too important to leave to economists. okay, and especially politicians. Greg Forster wrote this in the conservative Claremont Review of Books. He heads a Christian foundation. He's an acquaintance of mine. Many of the most visible capitalist intellectuals, giants like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, embraced a new moral case for capitalism that decisively rejected the old one based on the natural and divine significance of the individual, being created in the image of God, in other words. This new moral case was either explicitly or implicitly utilitarian and anti-metaphysical. They pointedly wanted to take us away from our Calvinist Judeo-Christian heritage in the economy. You might recognize this name. Congresswoman Bachmann calls that beach reading. She takes von Mises to the beach with her when she goes in the summer. Hayek actually said, by the way, Rand didn't like Hayek. He won a Nobel Prize. But he actually said the government might help during a depression. She said, "You're not my kind of economist." Mises agreed that the government should just stay out of everything, and she said, "You're my kind of guy." So she liked Mises but didn't like Hayek. A movement whose main purpose is the relief from responsibility cannot but be immoral in its effects, however lofty the ideals to which it owes its birth. Now, what he was talking about is the government taking over your responsibility to care for the poor, to care for yourself in your old age, and so on. But I would argue that that also applies to any movement that takes away your moral responsibility to care for your neighbor as yourself. And that's what we've had with some of these individualistic approaches. Peter Drucker once said, "Business ethics is not ethics at all, as the term has commonly been used by Western philosophers and Western theologians. Business ethics assumes that for some reason, the ordinary rules of ethics do not apply to business." One of the world's best management philosophers. Result, the trust in banks in the United States now rivals the trust in Congress and big business. And that's the sad part. You see, capitalism is built on trust. You know, I in Florida have people come in and I send money to Minnesota to do things up here. Why do people do that? People they've never seen. It's trust. When that trust disappears, as it did in 2008, capitalism starts to die. The church has a role in that. This article out of the journal, real quickly, I do have strong moral values, but I don't let them rule my life. Okay? Ravi Zacharias, an evangelical theologian in Jesus Among Other Gods, wrote about the syncretism the Old Testament prophets railed about, and he said, "Wealth and enterprise have so woven themselves around the message of Jesus that popular models of Christianity, appear as nothing more than self and greed at the center, with strands of Christian thought at the periphery." I left you this chart. You have it just very briefly. This is a political line. See this rough triangle? On the back of a dollar, there's a pyramid. Think of it when you see the dollar. On the left is what we call communism, Lenin. The socialist countries, as I showed you, are about half government, half private sector. And way over here is Rand. Now notice I extended the land a little bit because there are what's called anarchists who want no government. What Rand wanted is just enough government to protect her wealth. Okay, that's ancient Rome. They always had the legions. Okay, don't ask John Allison if you ever get the chance of BB&T Bank if the government should take away FDIC insurance. I've never heard a libertarian argue for doing away with that government benefit. Okay, the economists that correspond is Mises and Greenspan over here under libertarian. Conservatives would be Hayek. I'm kind of in this school. Liberal would be Keynes and Krugman. You may read him in the paper. By the way, I got an email from a Tea Partier the other day that talked about Obama being a Marxist, and it was very derogatory. Please understand, you know Marx was an atheist late in life, but he grew up Lutheran and Jewish. And I think that influenced his thinking. There are some passages of Marx. Luther once said that whoever lends money and doesn't share in the losses when things go bad is no better than a robber or a murderer. Okay, I was telling Tim earlier, Luther would have probably been to both the Tea Party and to the Occupy Wall Street. He was pretty tough on some of this stuff. Marx knew some of that, okay? And what Marx actually said was that capitalism, after the wealthy had all the money, the workers would rise up in one of these movements, take over the government, and then it would become communist, and that's what Lenin did. And that's where most of us think it stopped. But you know, Marx actually said that communism would then dissolve and the state would disappear. What he was worried about was that Wall Street and Washington would get together and rob the country blind. Is that what the Tea Party's upset about? So if you're a Tea Partier, please don't refer to somebody being a Marxist, okay? Because it sounds a little bit like Moses, if you will. Down here I put religious attitudes about wealth, from ascetic to materialist. Nuns, Mother Teresa, died with her glasses and the bowl she washed in every day. The Amish, then the Mennonites, Catholics, Reformed, Baptists, Calvinists, and evangelicals. Evangelicals are the most liberal of all that I've ever seen. Last month's Christianity Today had a story about Dave Ramsey, one of those debt guys, and it talked about me. His website actually says you do not want to have any ethics when investing on Wall Street because it might cost you money. And they asked me about that, and I said, well, frankly, it's a pretty sad state of affairs when that's considered a slippery slope. He called that a slippery slope, that if you start having ethics, good, who knows what might happen to you, okay? I told him that was a little bit like teaching children shouldn't give pennies to missions because they might end up tithing. Isn't that a terrible slippery slope? But anyway, you should know the main evangelical financial planner in the 90s was called Ron Blue. He had a company called Ron Blue and Company. It's still the largest Christian firm in the country, financial planning. If you ask it about ethics, they have a form letter that they send you to tell you why you shouldn't worry about ethics on Wall Street. And yet we're worried about 3%. Jesus called that straining gnats and swallowing camels. You see, it's a little bit like, what's the root of all evil in the Bible? Love of money. But today, I would almost bet that most people, if a Martian dropped in, use that old analogy, he would think homosexuality was. You see, there's probably 2% who are interested in that issue. You know, our problem as the Lutheran Church is we've forgotten to talk about the root of all evil, so now we're talking about straining gnats, and it's torn our church apart. And if we'd have been on the forefront of teaching these biblical principles about what the true root of all evil is, we wouldn't have people protesting on Wall Street and Washington and so on and so on. Christianity Today said, for Christians, the integration of faith into all areas of life rests on Christ's vision for his church and the world. Faithful believers may not bracket off from God any part of the world, however resistant it may be to godly influence. Remember the rich young ruler went to Jesus? He said, what do I need to do? He said, you know the law. And he said, I've kept them all. Do you know that meant including tithing? That was part of the law of Moses, right? So he was a tither. Jesus said, okay, now let's talk about your money. What's it say? He went away sad. It doesn't say he went away destined for hell or unsaved or anything. He went away sad, which is kind of what America is today. We have compartmentalized our faith away from our money, and all of us are pretty sad about what's going on in Washington and Wall Street today. Peter Drucker once said, it's futile to argue, as does the American economist Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, that a business has only one responsibility, making money. Making money is the first responsibility of a business. A business that does not show a profit at least equal to its cost of capital is socially irresponsible, like the internet companies. But economic performance is not the sole responsibility of a business. John Schneider, and I want you to listen to this. A lot of you are probably Lutherans. I want you to understand I'm speaking at Luther Seminary on Sunday, and this is what I'm going to tell them. Here's why, of all the churches I've belonged to, I joined the ELCA, the Lutheran Church, after I studied theology. John Schneider of Calvin College wrote, it's possible to envision a time when evangelicals have the consistent Christian perspective tools, or worldview, that they require in this area of life, economics. But it's probably best to expect Christian theology for life under modern high-tech capitalism to come mainly from where it now does, from Jewish, Catholic, Reformed, and Lutheran sources in which traditions exist for relating doctrines of creation to matters of redemption in a modern economic context. You know, they teach that debt is unbiblical. Jesus on the Mount said, lend to whoever needs it. Don't worry about getting repaid. It's a way of meeting short-term needs, temporary needs. Okay? What the Bible forbade was the earning of interest. But you can go to evangelical website after website that says debt is unbiblical, and they don't say a word about earning all the interest you can. Capitalism turned the Bible upside down, guys, economically. You have to admit that. If I wanted to be an old biblical fundamentalist, I could not work on Wall Street and help you earn interest from your muni bonds and government bonds. It was the Reformation that said that's okay. So capitalism can be Christian, but it's not biblical. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. Capitalism could not exist until Martin Luther and John Calvin came along, and evangelicals don't have any of that tradition and don't understand a bit of it. So they have to do theological gymnastics. Let me close with two golden rules for the second, perhaps third Reformation of the church and then society. Listen carefully. I believe Jesus reformed Judaism. Of all his roles, he was a reformer. The first thing he did on Holy Week after walking around the country for 3 years is he said, I've got to deal with money in the church. And so he went and used a whip to clear out the money changers. When Martin Luther launched the Second Reformation, he did it after hearing Tetzel, a fundraiser, promise that people would escape hell for indulgences because Tetzel was raising money for St. Peter's Basilica. Luther went home that evening and wrote the 95 Theses. Approximately 40 of them, depending on how you read them, is about money. Okay? You won't have a reformation of the church and a moral reformation of society until you deal with money. Forget the politics and so on. Deal with money. And that's what we've got to do today. Start. Count your blessings for true change. Mark Buchanan wrote, in the Garden of Eden, the first thing the serpent did was create in Adam and Eve a sense of scarcity. The serpent's trick then as now is to turn this staggering abundance and gracious protection into frightening scarcity. The serpent lied and we got taken in. Now, despite the overwhelming evidence that we live amidst overflowing abundance, as I've just shown you, we always feel it's not enough. We sense it's running out. The deepest theological concept is thankfulness, because to know God is to thank God. Who are the rich? At the time Jesus spoke those words, the average person in the world lived on $450 a year. I spend a lot of time in Uganda. Sub-Saharan Africa still lives on that. Okay? Who is the rich? We all are. Okay? Until 1,000 years, we made no economic progress. The Reformation helped it start, and then the Industrial Revolution and so on, the Enlightenment and so on came along, and there we are today. But think about this. I once used the rich. I said something about the rich with Jack Kemp over breakfast. He was in a grumpy mood. And he said, if you ever use the word rich again, I'm going to kick your backside. And I had to remind Jack that he was a quarterback and I was a fullback. Okay? I was a little bigger than Jack was. Jack was pretty feisty. He was an all-pro quarterback, you know. But politicians will not use the word the rich. Spiritual people, religious people have to use the word the rich because we are all the rich. It's not the Forbes 400. It's everybody here today. The average American, 1880, made $3,000 a year. In today's dollars, we now make $58,000. Get this. If you remember one thing leaving here tonight, it's this. Economists just had the first estimate of what the average person on earth is worth. The Economist magazine reported it. If you had $2,161 in the year 2000, you belong to the wealthier half of the human race. $2,100 is the average net worth of the average person in the world today. Okay? When I wrote my first book 20 years ago, I began with this verse. And I think it's more important today than it's ever been in the 20 years since with this quote. Jesus did not speak directly against wealth and money lending, but he did emphasize the dangers of riches and the rich man's responsibility for the poor. Evidently, the continuing test of the capitalist is the priority of his love and the purpose of his riches. Do we love God and use money and people? Or do we love money and use God and people? Which do you use? Which do you love? The question for the future is whether an economy such as America's can retain the value of individual freedom, which is so important, but while recapturing a sense of social responsibility that Ayn Rand and Peter Drucker destroyed in this country. Richard Niebuhr wrote a book, The Responsible Self. He said, there are doubtless as many ways of associating Jesus Christ with the responsible life as there have been ways of associating him with the ideal life or the obedient or dutiful one. The Christian ethos so uniquely exemplified in Christ himself is an ethics of universal responsibility. What we have today is CEOs taking care of shareholders, and mostly CEOs. Okay, we've got more managerial capitalism than we have shareholder capitalism. What we have in Washington is people taking care of their special interests. Okay, and even in the church, I think, an awful lot of pastors today are just taking care of the people in their pews. Well, who's going to take care of the people that don't belong to those organizations? How many problems Jesus create? How much of the responsibility that he accepts for everything goes on? All of it. It's the exact opposite of what Wall Street and Washington are doing today. They're creating all these problems. Has anyone ever heard anybody say, I'm responsible for anything? We've turned that ethic upside down. Exodus 21 says, if a bull gores someone to death, is to be stoned, but its owner is not to be punished. But if the bull has been in the habit of attacking people and its owner had been warned but did not keep it penned up, then it's to be stoned, and its owner is to be put to death also. If you manage wealth habitually in a socially irresponsible way, Moses thought you should be put to death. You ever heard that in a church before? See, what we do today is we will let the bull kill people. I was in the tobacco industry growing up. Year after year, we grew that stuff and knew it was killing people. We couldn't smoke it. I often tell people we lit up at the mention of the golden rule, but we let other people light up what we grew every day. Okay? But if you put that in context of the tobacco industry and so on, it's a very, very tough rule. And that's what Jesus was getting at when he said, love neighbor as self. For 6 years, plant your land, gather in what it produces. 7th year, let it rest. Do not harvest anything that grows on it. The poor may eat what grows there, and the wild animals can have what is left. What's that say? Leave 14% of GDP for social spending. Do you ever think of it that way? And that was the minimum. Moses also said, when you walk along a path in someone else's grain field, you may eat all the grain you can pull off with your hands, but you must not cut any grain with a sickle. Remember Jesus being challenged by the Pharisees about plucking wheat on the Sabbath? Was Jesus a landowner? What would you do today if some needy person took $5 out of your ATM for a sandwich? There was personal property, but it wasn't an absolute. It was always subordinated to the needs of the poor in the Bible. Do not mistreat a foreigner. You know how it feels to be a foreigner because you were a foreigner in Egypt. I'm not a particular Rick Perry fan, but I was so disappointed when he plummeted after it was exposed that he had given in-state tuition to the children of illegal immigrants who were born in Texas, by the way. Okay, I'd have probably given them a scholarship. Anybody who rise from that level to go to college, goodness sakes, give them a break. Some of us thought Jack Kemp never resonated with the far right of the Republican Party because Jack was an all-pro quarterback and he showered with some very large black men who kept him from getting killed on Sunday. And so Jack ran HUD to develop housing and so on. And when he called, he believed in lowering taxes and all that, less government. But when he called for people to voluntarily accept responsibility for the needy in the country, he was never considered for the presidency. It killed him. I hate to see that still going. It has to happen. Why not be virtuous rather than pragmatic? Forbes last week published a special edition that said social responsibility will organize corporate America in the next few years because of the social media. Okay? The organizing that's going on Wall Street today, it said every business will become a social enterprise. And why be coerced? Jeffrey Sachs is the most prominent international economist in America. He went to taught at Harvard. He's now at Columbia, wrote this book. I picked it up just last week. He said, I decided early in my career to devote my energies to the economic challenges abroad. Now I'm worried about my own country. At the root of America's economic crisis lies a moral crisis, the decline of civic virtue among America's political and economic elite. Without restoring a sense of social responsibility, there can be no meaningful and sustained economic recovery. His problem, being a liberal, is that he says we're not meeting our responsibilities, therefore government must meet them for us. The price of civilization, in other words, is to raise taxes. I'm not here to make that political case. Wall Street Journal says religion and business do mix. This is interesting. We in the churches say we shouldn't talk about money in churches. The Wall Street Journal is telling you why religion and business do mix. There's several ways you can do it. My mentor, Sir John Templeton, avoided alcohol, tobacco, gambling stocks. He was a Calvinist. That means he can make money as long as he doesn't enjoy it. I told Money Magazine that one time. They put it on a full-page picture of John, and I thought he would kill me. Sin stock screening was alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. 5 of the largest mutual funds in the country do that, and you don't even know it. Socially responsible investing. Since Vietnam, people have added more and more causes to what they avoid. One of the leading funds last week, best performing funds, actually now avoids investing in Wall Street firms because of all the shenanigans going on there with proprietary trading and so on. Conservatives don't like the word social. Sounds like the social gospel and socialism, so they call it biblically responsible investing, even though the terms are sort of oxymoronic. Community development banking, if you don't like what your bank's doing with your money, put it in a bank that finances businesses and houses for the inner city poor, Native Americans, the poor in Appalachia, and so on. And then there's something called micro-enterprise lending, which is ministries that, in essence, make $100 loans overseas to the desperately poor. Oxford says every $100 loan changes 2.3 lives. Different things you can do. Here's the big point. I want to finish with this. We do not need a theocracy or theonomy in the United States. That's why politics should be careful with this. When you're in politics, you're going to mandate that people, whether they're atheist, Buddhist, Jewish, or whatever, are going to adhere to Christian principles. At some point, you have to decide where you're going to live. But on most subjects, we can learn to get along. What we should do, however, is every Christian should turn every aspect of their lives over to Christ and live it fully. Richard Rohr wrote in Jesus' Plan for a New World, near the end of the Old Testament, the prophet Zechariah says that when God's day comes, there will be no distinction between the sacred and the profane, temple and marketplace, lay, clergy, all the things we compartmentalize. The reign of God is not about churchiness at all. It has everything to do with everything. Your banking, your mutual funds, everything you do. Thank you for letting me be with me. I have a website if you would like to keep up on this. You will get slides of these things as you leave. And I think Pastor Tim has some closing comments for us. Thank you. Gary.
We have some treats in there, and I don't want to delay getting to those anymore. So we're going to not go with any Q&A tonight. If you want to talk to Gary in the narthex following, you're welcome to. I hope you'll join us for our next event, November 17th, with Billy McLaughlin. And I do want to thank all of our sponsors. You can read their names in the program, as well as the logos of our corporate sponsors. And again, with a special thanks to Thrivent tonight, for helping to make the reception possible. Gary, where'd you go? Oh.
Right.
You're hiding behind me here.
I've got feedback.
We're going to head out there if you want to talk to him. Before we do, though, if I could give you this, Gary. This is a little sign of our gratitude. It's a plaque. It says simply, with thanks to Gary Moore for bringing faith to life, and we do thank you very much indeed. Thank you.